and I'll verify.
Okay.
All right. Am I live?
Yep, you're live.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so I'm Richard Rasala. I teach this course in the springtime, but Jose has it to himself in the fall. But I've been called in to talk to you about connecting to the SQL Server database. And the reason I'm called in is because this is one of the most annoyingly tricky things to do in this whole web development course. So am I echoing?
Maybe I'm echoing.
Okay. All right. So let me explain what the issues are. The issues are that when you work on your laptop, you are in an entirely different environment than when the database is used by the web development code that you post on the web development server. The server is much nicer for you because your area, your website area on the web development server is connected to your area in the database management system by connection that validates your identity in both directions, so that you can, your web pages can ask for data in the database without providing any credentials, in visible credentials. You don't have to provide a username and password to go from your web pages to the database server when the stuff is live on the server. But that is unfortunately not the case when you are working on your local laptop. The database does not trust you because you're outside of its domain. And so you have to have a way when you're actually developing code on your laptop, which is obviously where you're going to develop it, you have to be able to interact on your laptop and be able to do some work there. But at the same time, you want to somehow be able to set things up so that when you move your web files to the real public server, the development server, all of a sudden everything still works, even though you were doing things in two different environments. So that is the trick, as to how to get all of this to work seamlessly. Now, the SQL Server is highly protected by our systems people. They do not allow me to do a direct shell login to the development server, nor Professor Jose, nor anybody else. There is only one tiny little way that you can access the SQL Server when you're outside the system, and that uses a concept called tunneling. So the first thing I have to do before I can get into the details of how you're going to do work on the SQL Server is talk about tunneling. Now, tunneling means that you're going to take your laptop and arrange that it connects to some server out there that is capable of supporting a tunnel. And then, when you connect to that server in turn is going to have instructions to make a hop over to the SQL database server. There's a two-step process from your laptop to this friendly server that supports tunnels over to the database. Now, you would think that things would be simple because we already have a server in hand. We have the IIS web server that serves our web pages. And you've already done SFTP connections to the IIS server. And you say, well, gee, no problem. I will do a secure connection into the web server, which is right next to the database server in the building, and it will then do the hop to the database server. But the answer is that will fail badly because the web server has never had the software installed on it that allows it to do tunnels. Okay, systems did not want that capability added to the web server. So if you try to get into the web development server and ask it to make a tunnel to the database server, bingo, it won't go because the web development server does not support tunnels. So the situation gets even more complicated. Well, what servers in this college support tunnels? The wonderful Linux servers. They have been given the privileges of allowing tunnels. So very, very curiously for this particular course, in order to tunnel from your laptop over to the Microsoft SQL Server, you must actually beg permission from the Linux servers. You must do a login to the Linux servers and tell them that you want via this login to also create this extra tunnel into the database server. Now, okay, I'm going to first of all show you very simply. I have here my SQL, my Visual Studio 2000 something, and there's various tabs you can have. The Solution Explorer where your files are, and the Server Explorer, and up in the Server Explorer, data connections are available. And notice they all have red X's because none of them are opened. So I'm going to right click on the thing that goes to my database, and I'm going to say refresh. This should attempt to open it. But it's going to grind and grind and grind and grind and will eventually fail. Even though these were perfectly good settings that worked for me yesterday. But we're going to see what I have forgotten. Okay, so I have to wait and let this grind out until it stops spinning and it puts up the error message. It's going to basically say in fine print, a network-related error occurred, blah, 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 meaning it can't get to the server. Why can't it get to the server? If you remember the first part of this talk, I talked about tunnels, and I have no tunneling going on yet. So I will say, okay. And what I will do now is I will go over here to my secure shell software. I have slightly more expensive software. It costs real money to buy this, but it works. So I'm going to go into login.ccs.nu.edu, and I'm going to log in. So that is a login to Linux. Right, so now I'm in Linux. I could do an ls command and see what's happens to all the junk that's lying around in my Linux top level directory. So this is Linux. It looks like Linux. It smells like Linux, okay? Now, what I want to take a look at, see view options, session options, and I want to look at port forwarding. And what we will see in this particular software, and it's always different in the particular software, but I've created a name to remember it, SQL, and it says the local address is this magic number 1433. That is the normal port on which database servers operate. And I was going to say, okay, the local address is 1433, but I want 1433 to resolve to a remote host. MSSQL 2005.development, blah, 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 blah. Now, the first point is you don't ever want to type that, okay? When you're setting up your tunnel, you want to be smart enough to go into my help pages and copy this and then paste it so that you don't have typos. This is particularly interesting because it's MS SQL. I've seen so many people who have 3 S's or 4 S's or whatever. You know, typos nuke you, right? You copy and paste whenever possible. Now, let me go back, put this out of the way for a moment. And I look at this port forwarding, and basically, I've already added the port. I mean, I said locally I wanted this, and remotely I wanted this. And also when I set it up, I said don't allow remote connections. That means don't allow somebody to come into my laptop and use my tunnel to go over and get to the database. The only ones allowed to use this tunnel are the laptop itself. And you'll notice that the laptop is, well, it's a local address. So I'm going to cancel this. I've already got the tunnel going. Now, the fact that the tunnel's going, I can just hide this. I don't need it. I just need it running. I need it connected to Linux with the tunnel operative. And then I go over to here and I'll prove that things work. I will refresh and the X goes out. I get little arrows. I can see tables. I can see all sorts of stuff. I can right click. I can say, show the table data, blah, 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 and it will come up in a moment. So this is a table that lists some browser names, and then it lists some counts. And I'll show you this silly little app that fills in this table later. But the point is obvious. If the tunnel doesn't exist, you're toast, right? And if the tunnel exists, but you have forgotten to launch the secure cell pathway to the Linux server in which the tunnel is set up, that even though you did it once, it will not work for you at this moment. You have to always remember. And I'll tell you, the number of times I have forgotten to open the connection to Linux so that the tunnel is active as a legion. So it's a very common bug. And it's a human bug. It's not a bug of the software. It's a human bug forgetting that that needs to be done. All right, so we're set there. I have proved, this is data in a database. Unbelievable. All right. Now, I mean, I could even change this data. I could put a 14 here. It returns. So now I've got 14 in this table rather than 10. Let me amuse you by showing you the contents of this table. I have here a little tool called the databases tool. This is very generic ASP. The Rasala databases, the login databases, the Pubs database, which is a read-only database supplied by Microsoft for testing, and the Northwind database, which is another read-only database supplied by Microsoft for testing. I'll go to the Rasala databases, and I will further ask for the browsers database. I will look at the browsers database, and bingo, 14 is in there in the first cell. So I had access to the database and changed the contents of the database by direct typing. Okay, I mean, I want faith here. I want faith so that you will actually believe that should you choose to want to use databases, it's doable, but a certain amount of care is necessary. All right. All right, so this is this table. Now, we get to another story, is how did I manage to get this stuff to show these databases later in this lecture. Okay, so, all right, so I'll close this database. So right now, the Rasala database is open, and the other 4 databases I have not opened. Now, I tested the following thing yesterday, is could I delete my saved connection to the pubs database and then rebuild it? So I'm not going to delete my connection to the Rasala because I need that too often. But I'll try by doing this. I will click on this, and I will right-click and say delete it. It says, do you really want to delete it? Yes, because I want to prove that it's doable, that you could put it back. Now, all of these connections, I can't control the font size here, but all of these connections right now are labeled with something I call connection strings. But when I do the pubs database now live, it won't be labeled by a connection string. But later, after I shut down this and come back, it then labels it. Because I've already set up something called a connection string. You might say, oh my God, I thought all I had to learn about was tunnels. Now I have to learn about connection string. All right, so I'm going to right click on data connections. I'm going to tell it to add a connection. Now, so the data source will be a SQL Server client. Fine, that's okay with me. Now, what is the server name that I'm going to? Next big mistake. You go over to this web page and you click here and you say, I'm over on this web page. Come on. And I'm really clever. I'm going to select the name of the server and put it in that box. No good. Error, error, error. Why? Because the server is protected from a direct access from your laptop to it. That's why we're doing all this tunneling game. So if I just copy this and paste it in to this dialog box, I am toast. What I need to type into this dialog box is 127, period 0, period 0, period 1, which is universally the internet address given to a machine itself. Each machine on this planet viewed as going to itself has this address. So I'm saying that the server is at 127.0.0.1. And it looks for the moment that I'm saying that this Microsoft SQL Server owned by the college is sitting inside my machine. How foolish of me. But no, I have an active tunnel. And therefore, when the active tunnel starts at my machine, 127.0.0.1, and these database connections are going to go on port 1433, but because the tunnel is active, when you get something that says go to 1433 at this machine, it's going to say, well, I'm actually instructed to follow the tunnel. And it follows the tunnel over to the Linux server. And the Linux server says, now that you're here, go over to the SQL server, MS SQL, blah, 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 there on the port 1433 on that machine. And that's how you will make the connection. Is this not amazing? It is amazing, but it works. Now, I want to say I want to use SQL Server authentication. Now, we are identified. I was Rasala until I lost the ability to type. So we're identified with our CCIS usernames. So we use those in the web server, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the CCS. But we do not use our CCIS normal little password. So we get to another point. every one of us was given a special password for the SQL Server. And if you SFTP into the web server, there is a v40 directory for your web files. And in that web server, there's also a text file at the same level as v40 called sql.txt, sql.txt. And that has an 8-character password for the SQL Server that is your particular password for the SQL Server. And it's enough garbage that you can't remember it. So I have over here had a text file in which the password is typed. But since I know this is going on video, I'm not an idiot. I have made it 1-point font, but I will say Control-C to copy this password. Then I will paste it, Control-V into this box, and it shows up as dots. And since I want to keep this permanently, I'll save it. Okay, so this is the connection to the password, all right? Because I knew that somebody would be very clever and stop the video there and see if they could hack my database. All right, so there's the password. And now the next thing to do is to test the connection. And if it's successful, that means that this software went through the tunnel and found a live database that responded to it. It's sort of a database form of pinging, all right? Now, theoretically, I should be able to click this and get the database names, but I don't know. This is the latest version of Visual Studio, and so something has to break that used to work, all right? So, but I know what the database is that I wanted. It's PUBS. It's the pubs database. And I'm going to say, OK. And it's going to say right now, Berenice.pubs.guest. Now, I'm a guest because it's a read-only database, and I'm not its owner. So I'm going to be able to read it and so forth. But you see it's live. You see it's got tables. Like here's an author's table. So I will I guess, show the table data. And it has these various things like ID numbers, last name, White, Green, Marjorie Green, Cheryl Carson, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of people in the author's database. Now, this is very good because I can go back to here and I can go to the pubs database and I can use the store utility. And there we are with last name is White, first name is Johnson, Green, Marty, Carson, Cheryl, blah, blah, blah. So I've again seen the data there using my little web utility to see the contents of databases. Okay, so this is really good. I nuked the saved connection to the pubs database. But by going through these steps, I was able to re-enable it and prove to you that you could do it yourself if you had a database and so forth. Now, notice that my database is the Rasala database, okay? And because, as I said, after you restarted Visual Studio, they actually look up the connection strings and so forth and use the connection string. But right now, Berenice is the server name, pubs is the database, guest is my level of privilege, okay? And I just did that by this trick of adding a connection. So you have to put in, now, what do we have to put into that first box? This is the quiz. 127.0. How many of you ever heard the word localhost? Yes, and localhost is supposed to be the universal synonym for 127.0.0.1. However, Microsoft programmers are sometimes very dumb. And so if you type localhost in this box, you say, I know what localhost is. It's not a named pipe, blah, blah, blah. You dunce. You should always check that particular string first. And if it's localhost, make it 127.0. You don't write code like that. I mean, this has been in every version of Visual Studio. I mean, nobody there has been bright enough to write one if statement. If the string is localhost, we will replace it with 120. How much does it take? This is why you're coming to this college, to learn to do better when you're out in the world. Okay? So, but then we could go through the thing, and then you have to, don't use Windows authentication. We're using SQL Server identification, your regular username, your special password, blah, 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 and you have to type it in. Now, if you're making a string to connect to your own database, which may have no tables in it yet, you would still use your CCIS username as the access to your database. That's the universal convention. Your database is identified by your username. Hopefully, none of you picked pubs as your username. This would have been a very bad decision, or Northwind, or one of those things. Those would have been bad decisions. All right, but I don't need any more connections, so I'll cancel this. So I proved that we can have Visual Studio make a connection to the database. Okay. All right, so now I will unshow this table. All right, so now I have the tunnel open, and so I don't need that one. I have the tunnel open. So let me now run my home page from Visual Studio. So this will be a copy of my home page running on my laptop. Now you say, what do you mean my laptop? You're using this. I've actually done a remote desktop connection into the laptop in my office. And that just allows me to type in an environment where I know where everything is, as opposed to trying to type on the native environment of this box supplied by Central IT. And since I have a lot of files there, it takes a while. All right. So now, so this is there, and then I'm going to go up to, okay, so, all right, so now this is running on localhost. SQL Server randomly picks a port, so it's randomly picked 6167 for me. Now, when I go to do certain things, it may ask for my password because it actually knows I'm going into it from remote desktop connection. So we shall just see if I need to do this. So I have some experiments. And hello. Thank you, thank you. Come on. This is all supposed to work, right? Boy, I have a lot of very, very strange stuff. All right, so this is running off of the regular server. This is running off of, okay, so finally, boy, talk about JavaScript being slow. All right, so I'm going to go to Lincoln SQL experiments. I'm going to go to the browser popularity contest, and I will do the browser popularity. So now I'm running this on my local machine. Now, the only way the local machine can connect to make this experiment work is through the tunnel. If I don't have the tunnel running, this will fail. But I'm going to give some popularities to browsers. And since I'm very prejudiced, I'll give IE 10.5. I'll give no other IE any credit at all. I'll give Chrome 10. And then I tend to be, you know, in descending order, 9, 8, and Safari deserves to be better than IE, so I'll give it 6. So these are settings I'm going to set into the browser, and I'm going to submit these popularity counts, and then will show me what the current popularities are. And now we see IE 10 is 19. It was 14. I added 5 to it. And Chrome was 20. I added 10 and got 30. And so these various numbers that are here in the values up there for the popularities. So I've actually done a page in here without doing a user login that has actually changed the database. Now, doing that in general is a very, 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 very bad thing. Okay, because what we have found is that those students who have wanted significant data in their databases, but allowed the databases to be changed by users coming in just through an unprotected, unlogged web page, they have found that horrible stuff has been done to their site. They have been hacked. Northeastern is no longer hidden to the world, and hackers apparently need no sleep and do like nothing better than to mess up anything that is possible to mess up, even though it's a harmless student website. So the general rule is, if you are going to want your users to be able to change things in your database, you must create a login facility, and then you must give out the usernames and passwords only to your friends directly on pieces of paper. You must not have a login facility that says, oh, here, create my username and password. Because what's the point? I mean, if you're protecting things by login and you then say, I don't care who you are, Mr. Hacker, Mrs. Hacker, whatever you are, I don't care who you are, I'm going to let you get the credentials to get it and mess me up. What's the point? Right? It makes no sense. I mean, we've had websites that got hacked badly enough that Central IT said they were an embarrassment to the university and had to be taken down. So this is not a fictitious fear. I mean, it's now no longer possible. So now, why do you think I am not afraid of hacking on this database? Well, I'll give you an example. I'm going to try to up Internet Explorer by a lot. I'm going to make it 12. And I'm going to submit the browser popularity counts. My mouse. It says the data in the IE10 box is greater than 10. So I have put constraints on the data that prohibit you from actually putting in integers that are larger than 10. And you also can't put in negative integers and reduce a browser's popularity. Now, if you think about hacking my site, suppose you wanted to hack my site by getting ever larger integers. You would have to type them in. You would have to keep hitting this thing. And all you could do is change the data by 10. It would take a very, very, very long time to exceed the largest integer data point, right? So it's not worth the hacker's effort. Secondly, the database table just contains a string column, which is not changeable, those browser names, and an integer column, which is fixed size data. So no matter what horrible data they put in this table, it doesn't expand the size of the table. Okay, so I can't have a denial of service attack by having my database expand bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until system says I won't let it through. But if you have something in your database interest where the user is going to introduce a string of arbitrary length, then that goes into the table. The table has to go bigger to take care of it. Then they introduce another string and the table has to grow bigger. You could have a very interesting denial of service attack by just filling the database with junk. So I'm able to give a non-login page only because there's no way any hacker could actually change the size of my table. They could change the numbers in the table, but they all take 32 bits. So no problem, no harm, no foul. But anything that's actually more interesting must be protected. Okay, so that's kind of a little thingy, and then we can go. I mean, so the table still has the same popularity. I mean, I could, of course, go back and give it a 4, and then it will accept that. Hello. All right, so it gives new totals, and we now have 23. Okay, so that's that thing. So I ran this locally, and as I say, that could only have affected the database because the tunnel is running. So you may think you need the tunnel only when you want to look at the databases directly, but you need the tunnel when any of your software on your page is going to access the database. All right, so so now let me get into connection strings. All right, so close it down for a moment. So there's 3 pages at the web development home, which is ccs.edu.edu/teaching/web. And I've been looking at the accessing SQL page, and I basically showed you how to access SQL. If you go down here, there will be some screenshots for how to set up the tunneling in Bitwise. Okay. The earliest screenshots on using a trivial SSH client, basically that client has ceased to be operational.
One or the other.
Yeah, I would say it's one or the other. I would say if you're using Bitwise, use Bitwise. If you're using something else, but do not use the raw, awful SSH client that systems would give you. That's obsolete. It doesn't work. So anyway, this shows how I'm setting up my tunnel to login.ccs, my username, my password, blah, blah, blah. Store the password, because if you don't store the password, the tunnel ceases to work the next time you want to use it. So it's like pointless. Then you go into the options for Bitwise. I choose to open both the terminal window and the SFTP because I do both kinds of things against Linux. If you were only going to use the terminal window for this tunnel and you were never going to do SFTP into Linux, you could uncheck this box and it's less that comes up, automatically reconnect, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, there is a header that says C2S forwarding, client to server forwarding. That's a third tab we have to fix. And we have to listen on our machine 127.0.0.1. We have to listen on port 1433. We have to send it to MS SQL, blah, blah, blah. And this is what you copy and paste into there so you don't make a mistake. And we're going to destination port is 1433, and we'll call this SQL, this particular tunnel.
Does this work also outside of the university?
Yes. Yes, this tunnel works from my house. Because otherwise, how could this professor do his work in the middle of the night if the tunnel failed outside the university?
Well, do you remote in F5 or?
That's an excellent question, Professor Jose.
Oh, no,
I have a client that does SSH. It doesn't. I haven't tested this all in Bitwise. How do you think I got those pictures?
Oh.
But Bitwise is fragile. Okay, some of you have seen Bitwise cause trouble, not terminate properly, so it has multiple Bitwise instances running, etc. It can be a pain in the neck. So you often have to restart your computer with Bitwise. I mean, what does cheap buy you? It's free. I mean, what do you expect? Perfection. All right, so this is a $100 piece of software per year. So it's a different story. The one I use is very robust. But in either case, you are there and you're going to open the secure shell client targeted at Linux, login.linux.ccs, whatever that thing is, right? Who remembers? Yes, login.ccs.neu.edu. You'll be making a secure shell profile that is going to go to login.ccs.neu.edu because you're going to use it over and over again, right? So you save it as a profile as opposed to typing it every time you do it. You have this profile that's going there, and you've set up in the other tab on client to server forwarding, you've set up the particular parameters of it starting at localhost 127, blah, 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 1433, it's ending in MS SQL, blah, 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 at 1433, and you get it set up. So every time you use this particular profile to log into Linux, you're also getting the tunnel. Now, if you're logging into Linux for some other purpose, some other task, the tunnel is still there and it's completely harmless. The fact that you have this tunnel operational in your Linux login, so what? It's there if you need it. Otherwise, it quietly just stays away from annoying you. But I could log into Linux from California and the tunnel will work. Now, I don't know what would happen if I tried to log in from countries that block internet, but generally, you know, it works remotely. It has nothing to do with being next to the servers. All right, so we cool on that? All right, so this thing talks about bitfies, gives you the screen snapshots. Then it talks about using SQL Server Management Studio. Forget it, who needs it? And so these things are actually old snapshots. And then I have this final little pathetic comment. It says the web course uses databases as one possible source for backend data, but it cannot possibly take on the task of teaching databases in general or SQL in particular. Some students know lots about databases while others will be newbies, and I hope that those of you with expertise will be kind enough to help those who need help, should they want to do databases. So this is a kind of plea for help. Now, if you want to learn more about databases, you take one of Professor Jose's other courses, where he goes into that in more detail. All right, so, all right. Now, there's also another reason why this course doesn't teach databases, because one of the things I have hoped to do in my life is never have to learn SQL. Now, it's not quite true that I've learned zero SQL, but I have allergies, and so I don't want to learn too much of it. But I learned enough. I've learned enough. All right, so now, connection strings. So let's go here. There's another tab in this web development home. So after accessing SQL, there's connection strings. All right, so what are connection strings? You want to be able to have access to the database from web pages that you write, or access to the databases from web services that you might create on your server side in the IIS server that would in turn transfer that database data to your client browser for further processing by the client browser, say using JSON trickery or whatever else you would want to do. Right, so that you have the database server over here, the back end here, and then over here you've got your web server, and it's serving the web pages. And then over here you have the client, and the client is asking for the web pages, but the web pages might need to get some data from the database, and so they have to be able to talk over to the backend database and get the data and bring it back into the web pages. And then the it can go further. But if what you're accessing on the server is not a page, but it's a web service, then its job on the server is just to get data and send it forward in some format. Now, it's going to get the data from SQL in some bundle, and then you have to decide, how am I going to bundle that data when I want to send it further down to the client? Am I going to send it as a comma-separated list of rows in text, or what am I going to do with it? I mean, so there'll be some questions. So obviously, if your client is much happier with JSON than it is with comma-separated lists, then you have to do some processing on the server once you get the data from the SQL server in order to map it over to the client, right? Is that true? I speak okay? I mean, you're the database expert. So, all right, so the connection string is essentially a long string that has everything that the web software needs to connect from the web server over to the database. Okay? This is the idea of a connection string. And life, but as I say, there's an essential problem here. So the essential problem, yes, do not hide from these students that there are more problems. The essential problem is that when you're running your web pages on your local laptop, they are not technically in the same environment as they will be when you put the pages on the server. And there's nothing worse than having the situation where you write a beautiful web page or suite of web pages and you post them on the server and they all break because something is different on the web server than on your laptop. Okay? And that's exactly the scenario that will happen if you're dealing with a database. It's exactly the scenario because on your local machine, when you go to use your web software to deal with a database, you will have a string that says how it's supposed to find its way to the database. And that string will unfortunately not be identical to the string when you are on the server. Now we're going to figure out why before we look at the details. Because when you are on your local machine, your only pathway to the database is by 127.0.0.1 using the 1433 tunnel to the database. So in fact, when you tell your local software to search for the database, you tell it to search at 127.0.0.1. But you now go send your files over to the web server. And the web server is not going to find the database at 127.0.1 itself. No, sorry. It's not going to do it that way. In fact, it's going to use the full official string, MS SQL 2005, blah, blah, blah. And it's going to say, aha, that's the connection. But it's one of my friends. I know that database. I got that full internet, but I know that database. And we are friends. And I know so-and-so owns this particular website. And guess what? So-and-so owns some tables on that database. I could just make the connection smooth, no passwords, no nothing, because I already know all the identities. So in fact, you don't even need usernames and passwords when you go to the web server. So it's entirely different. On the local one, you're going to 127, and you need usernames and password, and the other one you don't. So you really want those strings that define the connections in separate files, or it's really problematic. Right? Now, these connection strings but then you would have to have a whole web.config totally for your local machine. And then you'd have to have another whole web.config totally for the server. And let me tell you, that's very fragile to maintain. Because if you add something on your local machine to the web.config, you've got to remember to add it to the other one. So what you really want is a universal web.config that works everywhere. But that means you can't put the connection strings in the web.config. You want them in separate files. So let me go over to my machine and show what I've done. So I'm in the Server Explorer. I'm going to go back to the file system, and I'm going to open web.config from my machine. Okay, and it's a configuration file, and it has lots of stuff, lots of little definitions, which Microsoft stuffs in there because they didn't remember to make them defaults and so on. But in any case, I have here as a very first line in my file, it says for connection strings, go to a source file, which I happen now to put in a subdirectory because my main directory was getting so cluttered. I mean, in the notes on the website, it's in the main directory. But it says go to the config subdirectory, find a file called connectionstrings.config, and load that file. You say, but wait a minute. how is that any better? It's still, you have this web config file, but now you've set it to load a file, and that other file is a fixed file name. Why is it an improvement? Well, I'll humbly say it's because I'm a genius. The point is that I have multiple files that will play this role. And I have one file, which I call connection strings for a remote machine. That's my laptop. I have another file that says connection strings for the server and so on. And then I arrange that the particular correct one is duplicated and just called connection strings. So when I'm running on my local machine, connection strings that config is identical to the connection strings for remote. And when I'm running on the server, connection strings is actually identical to connection strings for the server. So I mean, here I have here a config directory. I will open la-di-da config. You know, so there's connection for CCIS. That's if I'm in the labs. For remote, if I'm on my desktop. For the server, if I'm on here. And so this, for example, is an example of the connection strings that will go to the server. I'm willing to show you that because they don't show you my passwords. Okay. It says the data source. It says initial catalog. Integrated security is true. Persist security info equals true. And it just says the catalog, which is the database table we're going to, is Rasala here. It's Rasala here. It's Pubs, Northwind, AdventureWorks, AdventureWorks. So those are the various database zones I could get to. And I have a connection string for each of them, period. But these are the ones that are going on the server. And aside from the first two, which identify me because it's my own tables, it's all golden. I just tell it what to do. So these are the various connection strings. Now, actually, the local SQL Server connection and the Rasala connection are identical, but that's because Microsoft did another dumb thing, which is hardwire a name of a certain pathway as local SQL Server instead of allowing it to be user configurable. So because they hardwired it, I have to actually have this first and second definition identical. More about that later. But this is the example of the connections for the server. Now, let's just take a look, see this picture of the server. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to go to site statistics, blah, blah. Maybe I should have done it the easier way, but I go down, and I find there's the config directory. I go to the config directory, and there's a connection strings.config, and I look at its file. And if you take a look at this file that's posted on the server, it's identical to what I just showed you as connection strings for server on my local machine. So I moved it to the server, but then I got smart. I changed its name to the generic connection strings period config. I took out the characters for server, those 9 characters, and made it now match what it should match. So you drag and then you rename it. Simple. It was all golden. Now, since this database is not getting new things that you can access, really you can build these once and for all. Now, if I wanted to show you my actual connection strings.config, I would first make this window quite a bit smaller, and then I would, so connection strings.config, and you would begin to see that I have data source is 127.0.0.1, and then it starts to say the initial catalog is Rasala, and then it starts to the user IDs and the passwords, and I don't want you to see my passwords. So you've got a few characters that you could capture, but not enough. Okay, so I don't want to do that. So how do I explain, how do I make it easy for you to do this type of stuff. All right, well, on this connection strings page, I explained that there's going to be potentially that there's going to be this general connection strings file. Now you'll notice here, it says tilde/connection strings. That's the when I did it years ago, everything was at top level. And I just made the config directory because my top level was getting bloated. So it could be you could do this at top level if you're not going to have a bloated top level. But if you want to tuck it somewhere where you can put it down in a subdirectory. All right. So, and then this is the connection strings invocation in the web config file. And then there are basically three possibilities. The first is when you're connecting from your remote machine to the SQL server, and then the data source is 127.0.0.1 because it's the tunnel. Everything is the tunnel. And the second is if you're in the CCIS lab. Now, really, most people no longer work on the lab machines for this course, but theoretically, you could load all of your software onto Linux and then access it because there's a connection to the Linux file system on the lab machines, access that software and then run out of the lab. And then you'd be in a slightly different configuration. So there's a special way to set up the connection strings. But if you don't ever want to use the lab machine, then you don't worry about that. And finally, there's what you do on the server. Now, on the server, it says password should never be used under any circumstances. So at least when I grade, and I think people are, first of all, I grade sites, and there's some sites that have done brilliantly. So I know everything is perfect because they're getting all the details perfect. But I get sites where everything's looking really rugged. I mean, not terribly good. So then I'll just go in and say, let me just find out if they put their SQL passwords on the server. And then if they put their SQL passwords on the server, that's a nice automatic delete in the grade. They can't argue. It's not arguable. If your SQL passwords are visible when I use statistics server, then toast. That's an automatic grade deduction. Okay, so you basically remember what I just said here. You make sure they never get there. Now the only way they get there is because you've grabbed some version of your connection strings for remote and just blindly pushed it up to the SQL server. Now it's sitting there with all those beautiful passwords. And anybody who wants to look in that file can just read anything they want. And now goodbye to your database. So, okay. So anyway, that's the situation. So there's two things to really focus on, remote and IIS server. And since I do not want anybody to type anything, what I basically do is I give you almost exactly the content of the file that you will create for connection strings for remote. Here it is. You can copy and paste it. Now, there's only one tiny catch. This one was based on my user ID Rasala. And so you must now, once you've created the file, do copy, search and replace, and every instance of Rasala gets replaced by your CCIS username. That's not a very long operation, right? You do that. Then I have not told you what my passwords are, but every instance of 3 dots gets replaced by your SQL password. Save the file, done. That's the file for the remote machine. You also then copy that file to just connection strings, period.config, because that will be the one that's running on your local machine. Now, why do I have both the version for remote and an exact duplicate without those words for remote? It's because you can have a catastrophe and you mess up the one that's connection strings.config. You open it, you look at something, you make a typo, you forget about it, you save it, and it's wrong. But if you have the backup with for remote, you can always get back to where you should be. So that's safety. Okay, it's not operating the software. It's using your head about safety. So that's one of the things you do. And then for the connection strings that are going to be on the server, I'm going to skip the CCIS lab machines. I give you exactly the same kind of thing, which is now set up with the catalog, but with all the incantations about integrated secure, blah, 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 all the things that tell the It's a little hard to mouse on this surface. Anyway, so here we go. We've got this thing. So everything's completely set. And you notice the data source is quite different. It's MS-SQL 2005.development.ccs.edu.edu. And well, what you've got to go through here is so one instance of copy replace. So is this that difficult? Not physically, not in terms of the work you need to do. The real difficulty is keeping your head straight, because now we've had like 5 different things you've got to figure out and do precisely right. And it's, I mean, I don't like this. I mean, this connection string stuff is really, really, really old fashioned. Okay? If you look at this, this looks like XML with attributes, except that everything's in a single string, semicolon separated. I mean, the problem is that this technology of connection strings was invented before, using attributes. This really should have name equals this, data source equals, initial catalog. They should all be separate attributes, and you should just have this running like a little standard piece of XML with attributes. But unfortunately, everything's scrunched in one string. But copy paste will save you. Okay, you're copying this whole thing, and then you just do the replacement, save the file. Now this is the one you'll save for the server, then you'll drag it to the server, and then you'll omit the word for server. You'll just type on it and get rid of those 9 characters, and bingo, your connection strings on the server are set. Now, and the web config should be as I showed you. So there we are. So you could do this. Now, let me so we have about 40 minutes, right? Okay. So now I'm going to show you, if I need this stuff, I'll get back to it. I would like to show you how I can click a link and I can make a story that shows every single table in a database. Now this table has no rows, so it's empty. This has rows. So I can see this is the north wind, which is a little sales table, and see everything in it. This is all. Now, you've obviously got to believe that I did not, for every single one of these tables in this database, write software to get that particular table individually and repeat this 30 or 40 times, right? Just simply, it's obviously, if I'm a software developer, that's not the way to go. So, no, but I have a story, and let's go over here, and let's, oops. This is a little bit too small. All right, so I made this story, and there's a what is next page at the beginning so that you can get the table of contents for the story. The what is next page uses the same story as the story you're doing. The story is here called story_northwind.txt. That's the name of this story. But now you take a look at the next lines, and they show you something interesting about how I'm getting this stuff done. I have one particular piece of software called database.aspx. And it then gets a query string. And this query string has 2 parameters. The first parameter, CS, is the string name of the connection string on my machine. Okay, that's the connection string I want you to use. So since this is for the Northwind table, I want you to use Northwind connection string. And the other one is the database table that you're going to want to access. Now, the Northwind table was built using the standard Microsoft of a schema name and a table name. So the schema name is the same. It's DBO. And the convention is you say schema name period table name. And so we get dbo.categories, dbo.customer, customer demo, customer demographics, and so forth and so forth. So that's how you give the table name. Now, occasionally, table names in SQL tables have blanks. This was a feature, right? SQL was built long before the web. Blank is forbidden in a web URL. As soon as a blank appears in a web URL, the processing of the URL comes to a complete halt. So here is this table order details in the Northwind table. And it's actually order blank details, which I can't put on the web. So what I do is I bracket this and I use the hex encoding of a blank, %20, because blank is character 32 in the character set, which in hexadecimal is 20. And so it says, when you see %20, replace it by the corresponding character, and then the blank gets put in after the fact. And so that's how I get tables that happen to have blanks and I can still see them. Of course, when I put the table name in the drop-down menu of the story utility or in the front where you're seeing the table of contents using what is next, then I can put the blank in there because this is not a web URL. This is text that's going to the screen. So I could show that way. And so, here I am in my story. I can go back to order details, and there's the order details. Bingo, you get all this stuff. Order ID, product ID, and anybody who's been in the SQL world, you know that this is one of these tables that's helping to make a join. Okay, and there we have it. So this is the zen of doing this. Now, let me say, you've done a magnificent amount of work on databases for this course. Let's hypothetically, you've done a lot on databases. And you want a really great grade. And Professor Jose has a small number of minutes to view your site. But you'd really like to show off what you did with your databases. You could make a story like this, just like this, so that he could just examine your databases by very simple clicking and see exactly what you've done. Furthermore, your software changes the database as it goes on. He could bring up your database table and then do something with your software and then refresh to see that everything happened in the database. This would take seconds. Of course, if you don't provide this, it's much harder for him to see how beautifully you did your work, right? So this was designed to show students how it could be done. Now, let me go back to, I have a little bit too much expansion of the font size. I did it for that one particular text table. Let's go back here and say, what's in this file? Database.aspx. And it will show you the approximate level of SQL that I know. Now, in order to do this, for any database that I have access to on the SQL server, I had to basically write the code of this page using SQL because I could not assume that I had language integrated query, another topic for perhaps later, but I couldn't assume I had that, so I had to do SQL. So generally, I enable validation equals false because I don't want to get annoyed by Microsoft error messages. I have to import the library for SQL. This is a SQL client library. So here goes. Then I'm going to have script run at server. I have a page load command, I have a few more separate texts. I have a little bit of head data. And I don't do any view state on this page because it's pointless. I don't I never do a post back. And then I have some spans where I can show the connection strings. I can show error messages, blah, blah, blah. And then I have more stuff. And then finally, the whole thing is just totally magnificent. You go here, you have a grid view. That's Microsoft's tool for doing tables. I say that the data source for this grid view is going to be another widget called the grid data widget. Here's the grid data widget, ID equals grid data, run it server, and this thing has no other specs. So in other words, it's entirely built by software. I don't actually have any SQL commands in there, anything. I do it all algorithmically. Holy Toledo. Okay, this guy is told to look here, and when you look here on the page, there's nothing to tell you how to find the data. So, however, this whole Microsoft tool thing, this thing converts on the server side to an object whose object-oriented variable name is grid. This thing on the server side converts to an object whose name is grid data. Grid data will have type SQL data source. Grid will have type grid view. Okay, so that's the translation between markup and this. So let's see what is done here. Now, there isn't that much code on this page. The scroll bar doesn't get too long. So I'm running this script, and I'm going to try to get the connection string, and I'm going to try to get the database ID. So far, these are empty strings. I have some error messages prepared in case there are problems, like there's no connection string, or there's no database ID, or the connection string is invalid, or the database ID is all sorts of things like that. So I prepared my error waves, right? Isn't that always the way we're supposed to build software? Prepare the error messages in advance? Yeah, so I do that. And so I need to get the those query string parameters. And the way to get them in on the server side is to use take the request object. Each page has a request object which has all the things that came on the URL that requested the page to be made. So I have query parameters in the URL that's going to be held in there. So I asked the request object to get its query string object, and that turns out to be something called a name value collection. Why? Because you could have more than one query parameter, right? And so I call that collection. Then I go into the collection and I say, okay, into collection, do you have a query parameter called CS? If you do, return it into this variable. Otherwise, give me an empty string, which I'll use for testing. And do you have a DB parameter? And if you do, put it here. Otherwise, give me an empty string. What is double question mark? Anybody seen that in C#? Double question mark is a null test operator. So the collection here is actually a hash table, but hash tables in C# can be accessed with bracket notation like you were doing array indexing. So that's one of the overloads that they do with the array notation, is indexing into a hash table. So I don't have to do get key, get value, blah, 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 all that kind of nonsense. So in this collection, I say I want to find what's associated with CS. And if there is something associated with CS, it returns a non-null value, which gets stored. But if there is no query string corresponding to CS, then this will be null, triggering the null test operator to return what's on the right-hand side. So this means I'm guaranteed that the final value will either be the correct value or the empty string. I don't have to keep testing for null, null, null throughout that code. So then I have a test, is it trivial? Trivial means it's null or blank. And if it is, I produce errors. Otherwise, I HTML encode that string because I don't want nasty characters to get through to the rest of my code. And then, again, I check for triviality. Otherwise, I encode it. Then I'm going to return if I have no connection string. But now, next, amazing. Okay, I have a connection string. I'm going to try to get it out of my list of connection strings that I have provided in my config file. It's the only place where you can put the connection string. So I go to the configuration manager. I ask it for its connection strings database, and I give it this ID I just read from the query string. And then, since this is not a string for some stupid reason, that's connection string, it's a more complex object. I say, give me your connection string field, which is the real field inside it. So I grab the actual connection string with all that stuff about 127.0.0.1 or whatever it is, depending on where I am. I got the connection string with that name. And then if the connection string was trivial, I have another error. And the next thing I'm testing is whether the database thing is trivial. I'm going to return. Then I have to go through and I have to replace all these %20s with blanks, right? Because the %20s were in there in order to do the URL properly, because the URL can have blanks, but you can't send that to the database. So I do a replace in the DB string of the %20s with blanks. Then, bingo, grid data is a SQL data source. They say to the SQL data source, your connection string is this. That tells us where it's going, what database it's going to. Then I say, and the select command is to select everything from the DB ID, which is your schema.table. So you've got all of that. And now, bingo, bind the data to the grid object, which is the table. So that data gets it. This is the thing. This is a command that goes out to the database table, grabs all the data, and then it says, it grabbed the data based on the stuff, and it says, where am I shoving it? I'm shoving it right into the table. So all that table goes right into the table, and then just for user feedback, I put these IDs on the screen so they can see what they are. Okay, so that's just feedback. It has nothing deep. And there we are. And I've done something which is the universal viewer of database tables. And fortunately, this is just within the range of the SQL I know. Just within the range. Now, those of you who are SQL experts, you can do much more sophisticated things. But this at least is a template for getting data out of the database. All right. So I'm going to say some brief comments about language integrated query. So language integrated query is optional, first of all. Nobody needs to learn language integrated query if they want to use a database. You can just type SQL commands. However, language integrated query, instead of you typing SQL, which can get more and more and more arcane to get into the database, they provide an object-oriented layer so that you can talk to the database in an object-oriented way. Perhaps I should give you a small example. So let's go to statistics server, and let me find. Okay, so this is the experiments, the browser experiments. And so these are the two experiments. The first one is to change the browser things. And the second one, it's an alternate version of that. And then there should be a reset. Yeah. And then a little style sheet. So let's look at this file. This is the one I was running. When I did my little browser experiment, I gave each browser a rating, and I said add the ratings in. All right, so this file uses language integrated query. So, and actually it also used master pages, which if I were rewriting it again, I wouldn't. But, so that's a side issue. I have to import the library for language integrated query is supposed to be, we want to query a DB which uses SQL, but we want to query it in the programming language we're using on the server, which is C sharp. So what LINQ means use C sharp instead of using SQL. Fair enough? Okay. Let's see if I can do this in a couple of minutes. I want to give Jose a chance to wrap up. So, oh yeah, there are a few little thingies here. All right, well, let's see what we've got here. Well, let's see what's important. Because I used a master page, I have content areas that get placed on the page. So this first content area gets placed in the head, and all it does is bring in an extra style sheet, okay, which that goes to the bottom of the head section. And then this is content for the body, and the rest of the stuff is coming from some other master, whatever. Now, this uses an update panel, which is some way of making the page refresh nicely instead of refreshing in the ugly way that postback pages normally do. So I set that. You have to set that kind of thing up by saying you want an update panel, and then you must, inside that, create a content template, which is kind of stupid because actually if you said you want an update panel, what else are you going to put in there but content? But they require both things, okay? And then I have a div to give some CSS. I have some file view commands, which are my way of putting in links at the top of the page. Then I have the header saying we're going to do browser popularity, some messages for the user, a value between 0 and 10, click the button, so user instructions. Then there's another button to reset those counts to 0. That's simply because if you've got typing in those things already, you want them back to 0 before you type new things, to 0. And then I'm going to use something called a list view. All right, so what is a list view? List view is a good thing to use. It's kind of the fairly recent version of how on the server side you create iterative layouts. Okay. Now you might say, well, why? What is all this iterative layout business you're talking about here? This is the page we're talking about. So notice these are the links to the sources, browser popularity. We have these user messages to reset the counts to 0. So say I had typed in here 7, and I just want to start from the beginning. I can do that and reset to 0. That's what that does. And then there's the thing, next button, which is send the counts to the server, update the counts. Now, you'll notice in this interesting thing, I have a text box of a certain size, and I have a label. The labels aren't in the web page. They are the names that are in the database table. See, this is a database table which has IDs 1 through 11. It has a name column with the name of the browsers, and it has a count column with the integer count. So the page I'm showing you here, I could not hardwire these names onto this page because if I change the database table, I should have either new names or less names or whatever, or different names. I have to, in other words, have this structure be obtained from the database, which means I need to have a loop that's going to generate these things. Now, have you seen this in this class? Well, Professor Jose has shown you multiple ways on the client to gather things from sources and loop to make repeating structures on your client page. Stuff that was not in the HTML directly, but was looped in, right? AngularJS does this in mysterious ways, and jQuery does this in more transparent ways, but whatever. So there's these tools. that you can do iteration. So this is an example where I need to loop. I need to create a text box and a label, and I'd like them to lay out vertically. So I need to do that. So that's in this here. Okay, so I'm going to use what's called a list view. And a list view on a server says, okay, what is the outer part of the template? The outer part of the template will be an unordered list. It's going to end in here. And then you always have this fixed incantation. It's like magic, which says this is where in the overall template you want the repeating data to go. And they always use ASP placeholder, ID equals item placeholder, run ID equals server. Okay, so they always do this. You could change this to ID equals junk, run it equals server, but it doesn't matter. Everybody uses the same incantation. And then you have to say what an item is. And an item inside the listserv should be an LI, a list item, and LI. And then in there, I'm going to put in a text box. That's where the number gets typed. I'm going to put a few non-breaking spaces because I was very lazy with the CSS. And then I'm going to put a label which has an ID of name. And I'm going to tell it that the text inside that label is this incantation, which says container.data item, and extract the text using this incantation, which is what's being fed back by the language integrated query as those names from the database table. Okay, the list view is over. That's how I've done the repetition. Now let's see what we have here. There's a submit button, and then there is another grid view to show the results of the table. And this thing is similar to what we've seen already in that free-form database. It uses also the same code. So now let's see what we actually run on the server. So on the server for this language integrated query thing, we create a browser data context object database as new browser data context. Now, that's what you have to learn how to do if you really want to use this. There's a whole set of stuff on link, which would be a whole nother lecture, which I'm not proposing to give in 3 minutes. But there's a technique where you have a database and you create an object-oriented thing called a browser data context object corresponding to the database, or the Northwind data context object. Whatever you want to create, you create. And then I say the following, that, all right, if we are not making a post back, I want to go to the database object, which is this browser context database object. I want to go to the browsers table. I want to select using this lambda expression that B goes to B.name. So that's how the names get pulled out of the thing. So I could have gotten everything from the table. I could have gotten the ID, the count, and the name. But what I do is by this lambda expression, it says for each row, just return the name in the row. And name is the name of the column in the database. So it's returning a string. For each row, I get a simple string, which is why when I'm back up at the template level and I say in this label, I want to put in a name, I can just say container.data item because the container is actually an array of these strings. And that means for each item, just give me the string that's there. If I had more substructure, I would have to use a more sophisticated incantation to get out the name. Okay, but I made this example to be perfectly simple. So, okay, so I get the name, and then I put the names are tied into the data source, and we say data bind. That's always when you go out, actually grab the data and bind it in. Everything else is lazy evaluation. It doesn't happen until you tell it to data bind. And then I now go in here. Now I type in, this will reset the values in the numbers. Okay, there's a submit button. Let's look at the submit button. How does it get submitted to the database? So I have this whole view of this data, which is this whole collection. Okay, and I have a message string. And the first thing is I go down for each of the items in the view, and it says read the label whose original unmangled ID is called the name in the layout. Now, the thing is, all of this stuff is being auto-generated, line after line after line of these things. Text box label, blah, blah, blah. They all, in the template, they all have the same ID. How is that going to be resolved? Well, when Microsoft puts the stuff on the page, they do what's called a mangled ID that adds extra information to tell you where you are in your list. Okay? So you can find out back where you were. So you have to unmangle it. So what you do is you say, okay, I want an item. I want you to go inside yourself and find the control that originally had the ID called the name. Find that particular control. Now cast it in the object-oriented word to the label data type, then go in and grab its text, and now you have the name of the item. Woohoo! And then go to the text box. Okay, so that we got the name. Now we want to get the context, the text that somebody typed into that for the integer 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or they might have typed foo, right? So we don't know it's an integer yet. All we know it's a string. So we go in and we find the text that's in the text box. How do I go? It's an item. I find the control whose ID was originally text box. But I know it should be cast the text box type, bingo. And then I go in and ask what text is in the text box. Bingo, I've got that. And now I run parsing. I say, convert to an int32 that text. If the try succeeds, you'll have an int. If the try doesn't succeed, you won't. Catch with an exception. Then you test. If it is an int, you test, is it less than 0? Give another error message. If it's greater than 10, give another error message. Otherwise, you now do the absolutely marvelous thing. You say to the database object, the browser's table, do a single change that will, a single selection that will go over all the rows and pick out the row whose name is exactly equal to the name you found from the page. So you loop through all the rows until you get a match on the name that you were working with the page. And then on that particular row, you take its count variable and increment it by the count. And then you see not a line of SQL. And when the whole thing is done, if there's no messages, if no error message has been submitted, the message length is still 0, you tell the database, submit all the changes back to the server, and you never see an ounce of SQL. This is the kind of thing for lovers of OO code and somebody who are SQL challenged. Jose, you can wrap up. I expect that we email.
Well, no, I'd like to thank you for coming. I know you have a very busy schedule and things like that. Yeah, so up to now we've been doing some MongoDB, but the very first third of this course, we've been doing a lot of Angular, a lot of client-side development. We're replacing some of that Angular by jQuery. And we're replacing some of the web services using C#. We're going to be working more and more towards .NET technologies going forward, and more databases, .NET-based databases such as MySQL Server. So this is the beginning of our foray into .NET technologies.
Right.
And thank you for coming. So the same security issues that Professor Rasala was pointing out in using the SQL Server, I think they're also applicable if you're instead using MongoDB. I think those are applicable there as well. I mean, we get hacked, but you can get hacked as well in doing whatever application you're working on in MongoDB. So just like over here, we're suggesting, well, no, here is required that you have a login page if you want to have people enter data to the database. We suggest that you do the same thing if you're doing in MongoDB. Don't let people just go in and type anything they want, right? If you want people to enter any data, please have them log in, right? Identify themselves, and then have let them manipulate whatever data source you might have in your end. Yes. We do. I wanted to point out that we have restrictions about also creating accounts in our SQL Server machine. Yes.
Yeah, well, there's a whole login. There's a whole.
A little bit.
All right. So on my home directory, there is a login.aspx page. Oops, I should have run it. Should have launched it. All right, so this gives you the possibility of logging in. It gives you a ton of instructions, and it even gives you the usernames and passwords for the login. So you can track things through here. Now, the reason I give you the usernames and passwords is there is absolutely nothing useful you can do after you've logged in. So this is only pure demoware. I mean, there's no ability by using these logins to change anything. So I give you the things. So I don't know. Can I log in as Fubar? I don't know. Forget if I can log in. Let me log in as admin with the password. Anyway, this is on my home page, on the home directory. PASSWORD. I will go to login and whoops.
It's password. Just
Password exclamation point. So now we'll get you into, do I want to save it? No, leave me alone. And it will show you certain things that you could see if you were logged in as an admin and so forth and so on. So and these pages all then show you how you create zones. We're going to have a zone for an admin login, a zone for a member login, and so forth and so on. And they all give you all the structure and there are all these links. But there's nothing interesting to do other than see these messages. So it's not like there's harmful that you know these passwords because that's where it is. Now, and there are also discussions of how you can get the discussion of how you create the tables, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, so
maybe you want to invite me for another
we're
class.
going to cover user management in the .NET side.
Right.
And one of the restrictions that we're going to have is that you can't have people register on the .NET servers anyway. Right? You have to be able to create a limited number of accounts that they're going to share with us, the TAs and myself, which we're going to be using to log in and try out your applications. Yes, logging in as different personas, right, as different roles. But yes, you should not allow people to register, create new accounts. On your end, if you're using MongoDB, I guess it's up to you if you want to allow people to register and create other accounts to be able to use this. It is your site. You run the risk of people trying to hack you. But for us, the .NET side, we do want to restrict it to limit our vulnerability. Okay.
Because it's a cloud server.
It's a cloud server, yes.
Yeah, so there's a whole other story about login, but some of that on those pages, on the web development pages, stuff which is the homepage stuff, you will, if you browse around, you will find instructions about how to deal with login and so forth and so on. Yeah. And then they will direct you to this test page and so forth.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Now, do you want to clean up for?
Yeah. I'm not available this afternoon tonight, 4:36, as I usually am. I have a meeting now, and then I need to pick up the phone.